What now for Washington's relations with the rest of the world? Donald Trump fires America's top diplomat. Will Rex Tillerson's replacement toe the line with the president's vision for foreign policy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Carle. It was an abrupt end by tweet. After months of speculation and denial, Donald Trump turned to Twitter to fire America's top diplomat. Democrats say the loss of Rex Tillerson is yet another sign of chaos in the White House. Trump blames policy differences and lack of personal chemistry for the departure of his Secretary of State. The president's choice to replace him is CIA Director Mike Pompeo, whom he says shares the same thought process. We'll speak to our guests in just a moment, but first here's our State Department correspondent, Rosalind Jordan.
It's not every day you lose your job via social media, but an emotional Rex Tillerson deliberately ignored that detail when he addressed reporters on Tuesday.
I received a call today from the President of the United States at a little after noontime from Air Force One. My commission as Secretary of State will terminate at midnight, March the 31st.
Tillerson served as U.S. Secretary of State for a little more than a year. He spent much of that time pushing back against reports that the president, Donald Trump, wanted to fire him. On Tuesday morning on Twitter, Trump did just that. Mike Pompeo will become our new Secretary of State. Thank you to Rex Tillerson for his service. Trump then told reporters this.
We disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently. So we were not really thinking the same.
Looking back, it's clear Trump and Tillerson disagreed on the big problems of the day. Whether or not to engage directly with North Korea, how far to hold Russia accountable for its meddling in U.S. political and civic affairs, something Tillerson made a point of stressing the U.S. must do. Ultimately, former U.S. diplomats say Tillerson's firing is no surprise, and neither is the choice of his replacement, the CIA Director Mike Pompeo. He's well known for his support of Trump's policies.
Trump is impulsive. Trump is temperamental. Trump wants enablers and validators more than he wants advisors.
Tillerson didn't have many fans at State because of his plans to cut staffing by nearly 30%. Some senior diplomats quit in protest. But the firings at State didn't end there. At lunchtime, the White House dismissed Undersecretary of State Steve Goldstein after he released this statement suggesting Tillerson thought his job was safe. The secretary did not speak to the president this morning and is unaware of the reason for his dismissal. In any case, Tillerson said he had no regrets. Rex Tillerson didn't lose his job because he didn't agree with the president. Analysts say he lost his job because he refused to pretend that he agreed. If confirmed, Mike Pompeo will face a very high standard of agreeing with the president all of the time, especially because the president believes he already does. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, the State Department.
Well, the White House and Tillerson have had a series of public spats. Things were never quite the same after he was quoted as calling Trump a moron. The secretary's profound disagreements with the president on policy appear to be his undoing. Trump has made no secret of his distaste for the Iran nuclear deal, calling it an embarrassment to the United States. Tillerson argued that the US should remain in step with European allies and supported the agreement. Trump also publicly stated the former Texas oilman was wasting his time trying to negotiate with North Korea. Tillerson offered to begin direct talks with Pyongyang without preconditions. And he wanted to remain part of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Trump withdrew. Plus, when Saudi Arabia led the blockade against Qatar 9 months ago, Tillerson attempted to calm the crisis and mediate, but Trump undercut him by publicly siding with the Saudis. Okay, let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Washington, Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institute. From Brussels, James Moran, a former EU representative in countries throughout the Middle East, Asia and Africa. And from Whistler in Canada via Skype, Glenn Carle, a former CIA officer and Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats at the Central Intelligence Council. Great to have you all here. Michael, let's start by giving a thought, shall we, to Rex Tillerson. Was he a marked man ever since the day he refused to deny calling President Trump a moron?
Well, you're right that there were some tensions. Although I did not totally agree with the way that Tillerson was described in your earlier news report or the way in which he's sometimes been portrayed in some of the American media reporting here in Washington. I think that, in fact, some of the disagreements were not as profound as implied. For example, on North Korea, President Trump is coming around to doing exactly what Tillerson said he should do all along. So it's maybe more about personal chemistry and style. And then, as you say, some perceived slights here and there. I think Tillerson took far more of the slights and absorbed far more of them than he ever dished out. But President Trump's a very hard guy to work for, I'm sure. And Tillerson, because he was Secretary of State, he had to deal with so many issues so frequently that it was inevitable that he and Trump would be contradicting each other, since Trump was contradicting himself quite frequently. So I think it's unfair to Tillerson to say that he was somehow at fundamental loggerheads with Trump on a number of key issues. Trump himself was sorting through a lot of different positions, and he evolved a great deal in the 14 months that Tillerson was at Foggy Bottom. Trump changed a lot of his own views, and I think generally in a favorable direction. So I would give Tillerson some credit for having moderated and stabilized some of Trump's initial instincts.
Okay.
So it's a little different overall depiction than some of the common commentary.
Glenn, do you agree with that? Do you give Tillerson credit? Was he right for the role? Was he ever comfortable in his role as Secretary of State?
Well, I don't think he was right for the role, and he clearly was not comfortable in it, but he was a rare presence of rationality, reason, and relatively solid thinking with regard to foreign issues, which is why he was at odds and was with Trump and was struggling to change Trump's views. And I think that's ultimately why he was fired. The personal chemistry is important for Trump, clearly, as it is for most people, but especially Trump. But Tillerson was a voice of reason in the house of the Mad Hatter. And that's ultimately why he went. And now Trump has found someone who will be a sycophant and an aggressive one for him.
Well, let's talk about Pompeo in just a second. James, first of all, before we do, I want to know whether Tillerson was someone that the Europeans liked to deal with.
Yeah, Laura, hi from Brussels. I think, yes, indeed, there was a developing relationship with European politicians, although it must be said that I don't think Mr. Tillerson had really prioritized the European relationships, certainly not at the multilateral level, as much as his predecessors had done, although he may have been developing a little bit in that direction. Whether or not it's going to make any difference to policy, though, is another story. And, of course, that's another issue. How much did he and his staff, immediate staff, have to do with the development of U.S. policy? It doesn't seem that they had a great deal to do with it. It's coming from elsewhere.
Yeah, because French and UK diplomats, James, said that he never returned their calls or set up meetings. And one would think that these are very basic tenets of diplomacy that a top diplomat should have.
Well, I think he was probably on a learning curve, as the other participants have said. He and implied he didn't have a lot of experience in diplomacy before coming in, and his networks, of course, are elsewhere, although they are important networks that he has without any question. But well, he was I'm not sure how far up the learning curve he had got, but I'm afraid it's going to have to start all over again, at least so far as dealing with European countries and the European Union is concerned, now for his successor.
Absolutely. OK, well, let's look at his successor. Glenn, what do we know about Mike Pompeo? Why did he get the job?
Well, he got the job because he is an enthusiastic cheerleader for Donald Trump's ardent nationalism, isolationism, and opposition to the classic positions of American foreign policy, domestic policy, and the political structures. I think it's very important to state clearly that we all are in danger of normalizing what are extraordinary and dangerous views and perceptions. It should, frankly, be a completely disqualifying fact when someone denies science. And Pompeo says he doesn't really accept global warming. It should be a disqualifying fact when someone spends and rises his career and rises to prominence by championing the Benghazi investigations, which were clear to anyone who spent 5 minutes as a foreign policy professional, were a setup to destroy a political opponent. Similarly, with the birther thing, he was about Barack Obama's place of birth. That was a transparent lie. So one who makes his career in these things really should have no place in public affairs, and yet now he is one of the premier officials in the United States.
Michael, to what extent do you agree with that Pompeo has already, in many people's eyes, disqualified himself for this role?
Well, I think it was a well-articulated argument. I'm glad we have it on the floor. I'm going to give Pompeo a little bit more of a chance, partly because we have no choice. At least I'm not a senator, so I have no choice, and I assume the Senate will confirm him. But also, I think that Pompeo, while he does have some troubling aspects to his past, was also first in his class at West Point, was a distinguished U.S. Army officer, has a lot of intellectual firepower. But he's going to have to make a transition from being essentially in the opposition, as he was during his time in Congress, and going after President Obama on issues where he, I think, overdid it. I agree with that assessment. And also now where he's been the CIA director, and he could sort of report in a dour way on the state of the world and often blame President Obama's policies for that sorry state of things. But now he's going to have to actually make constructive new proposals on issues like North Korea and Iran, which, as we all know, are very fraught and could go in very bad directions. Pompeo's not going to have the luxury or the liberty of just complaining about where these current situations and policies are. He's going to have to help the president move forward. So it's a big test for him, and I do agree that he's going to have to handle himself differently in the future compared to how he has in the past. The only difference I would have with my colleague on the panel is that I still am somewhat hopeful that Pompeo can do so, given his abilities and his attributes. We'll have to see.
We've already established that when you're in these top jobs within the White House, your relationship with Trump is crucial. The personal chemistry counts. Trump has said of Pompeo that they're always on the same wavelength. But do you think, Michael, that that's quite concerning to hear that? Because A, will Pompeo ever dare to disagree with him? And B, if he does, is he out on his ear?
Oh, he'll definitely feel free to disagree. The question is, will he and Trump figure out a modus operandi where these kind of disagreements happen privately and where Pompeo picks his battles carefully? And, you know, I think Secretary Mattis is not a person who always just supports Trump's initial instincts. After all, when Trump came into office, he wanted to disband or at least weaken a lot of U.S. alliances. He wanted to throw up huge tariffs on many different countries. And certainly on the alliance issue and on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and elsewhere, Mattis ultimately had a lot of influence over Trump in that first year. But he had his disagreements quietly, and he chose his words carefully. And I think that's the sort of thing that Pompeo is going to have to do if he wants to be successful. Now, he and Trump probably agree on a lot of their worldviews, but that doesn't answer the question of what do you do about Iran? If you don't like the deal, well, great. What are you going to do about it? And so on questions like that, it's not enough that they happen to instinctively agree. They're going to have to fashion some successful policies together, and that means some degree of occasional disagreement will be necessary. Okay, well, let's look a little bit more at the Iran deal. James, Trump hates it. The Europeans are in favor of it. How do we see Pompeo moving this situation forward?
Well, I think he is on record as being very skeptical about the deal, and I imagine that he has views which are very close to that of the president. And of course, for the last couple of months, there has been quite a lot of activity going on, especially in regards to contacts across the Atlantic with the E3. Not so much with the European Union itself, I must say, even though the European Union was the coordinating agency for all of this in the first place. Which has been one of the problems, because the recognition of the European Union's role as European Union in all of this has always been very weak, even under Mr. Tillerson. But anyway, a lot of contacts going on at the moment to see how we can reach some sort of understanding as to how to flank the Iran nuclear deal. But I think it's very, very clear, and you've heard this from Paris, from London, from Berlin, and from Brussels, from all of the principals, that Europe is committed to doing all it can to stick by the deal. We do believe in it, and I think there's a very robust common foreign policy approach from Europe when it comes to the JCPOA. Now, it's important to try to find ways in which I say we can flank it, and there are things I know that are being worked on at the moment. But in terms of abrogating the deal or undermining the deal, the hope has got to be that Mr. Pompeo will bring, let's say, some solid military civilian thinking. One thing I would just add to this, to what the others have said, and the point has been made elsewhere, there may be a difficulty with language, with diplomatic language, speaking to the US administration now, as all of the principals on the foreign policy side are essentially from a military background. Tillerson was the last of the civilians. That may cause some difficulties in terms of understanding on the more civilian side of these operations going forward. The only civilian left in the game, it seems, in the US is Mr. Trump himself, and he's a very special sort of civilian.
He certainly is. Glenn, with this talk of these military men, I mean, I was listening to an interview today from someone in Iran who was saying that without this agreement, when the US pulls out of it, let's say it collapses, that the EU can't hold it together, he was saying that there is war possible between the US and Iran. Do you agree with that? Could that be possible?
I think we're a long way from war, happily, with Iran and the United States, happily. But things will become, the situation between the United States and Iran and in the Middle East and globally will become substantially more unstable if the nuclear agreement is abrogated by the United States. 75 years ago, one of the great minds of the 20th century, a French philosopher and political commentator named Raymond Aron, right after the liberation of Paris, had a meeting with, I think, the then foreign minister, and he was a young man, Aron was, and he said, everything is going wrong, and this is broken, and that is wrong, and why is the government screwing all this sort of stuff, and things should be different. And he went on and on and on, talking to his much more experienced professional. And then he finally subsided, and the foreign minister said, well, that's all very good, Mr. Aron, but what would you do? And Aron took that lesson with him, because it's easy to sit on the end of the bar stool and find that everything is broken and doesn't work right. But then what do you do? And the Iranian agreement has achieved, frankly, what would amount to just about a generation of stability. And no development by Iran of nuclear weapons. In foreign affairs, a generation is an eternity. The situation changes every day. But if it doesn't change and is stable over a generation, you've achieved an historic success. So to abrogate this with no plan B or nothing likely but increased destabilization and the increased likelihood that Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt would pursue nuclear weapons by cozying up even more with Pakistan is, frankly, lunacy. OK, let's turn our attention to an area where there has been action, quite significant and surprising action. That's with North Korea. Michael Tillerson, as you mentioned before, he wanted direct talks between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. So he would be supporting this Trump-Kim summit that is due to take place sometime before May, wouldn't he?
Well, I certainly am hopeful about it. A lot of people are wary. I'm wary myself, but some people are downright opposed to it. I think we should be a little more hopeful than that. At least we're not in a constantly escalating spiral of threat and negativity and bluster like we were for most of last year, along with all the missile and nuclear tests. Now, there's always a chance of a catastrophic failure of the summit that leads to then even worse dynamics after than before. So I think both leaders need to go in with realistic expectations and with an awareness that the idea of a deal on denuclearization is an extreme long shot, I think, to the point of not really being a realistic, attainable objective in this round. But I do hope that we can establish a process whereby at least perhaps we cap the North Korean nuclear and missile arsenals in a verifiable way in exchange for some modest lifting of UN sanctions. That kind of a deal Maybe some discussion of what kind of an international implementation force would have to go along with an ultimate denuclearization pact and a peace treaty down the road. Some of this conversation, to me, is much preferable to the alternative. So I'm glad that Secretary Tillerson ultimately prevailed on the president in this sense, and that President Trump seems at least willing to go ahead with the summit. Again, we have to see a lot of preparation between now and then, so the president's aware of how the summit could lead to a bad deal or fail, and that he not go in with unrealistic expectations. But for all of my criticisms of Donald Trump, I do think he's a reasonably experienced negotiator, and I think he has a gut feel for how talks can go well or badly. So I think there's a good chance that he'll be reasonably well prepared within the next 2 months.
Okay, that's certainly something we're going to keep an eye on. I want to turn our attention back now to the State Department. James, is the EU thinking that perhaps now, with Pompeo in line with Trump, we're going to see a State Department that's more in line with the White House administration, and therefore get a more clear foreign policy coming out of the US?
Well, it does seem as if Mr. Pompeo could be a more effective mouthpiece for the president, which is very important. The difficulty is what is coming out of the mouth, which takes us back to policy. So, for example, very soon we're going to be dealing with a new peace plan for the Middle East. I think it's coming on in the next few days, all being well. Quite how that is going to work and how it's going to be negotiated, especially after the Jerusalem announcement and all the other developments that have been happening in the last month or two, is anybody's guess. And it is something, of course, which is very close to the political and economic heart of Europe as well. How we're going to engage with that particular plan is moot. Very difficult to see how we can make progress going forward. Of course, we have to wait for the details of the plan to come out, but by all accounts, it's going to be a very, very difficult uphill struggle going forward on that. And, on Korea, of course, there the EU is not part of the initiative. I think the EU, everybody wishes it well. We hope it works well. But just one point there. There is a crossover between Korea and Iran. People have made this point many times before. If your partner is seen to be upending, undermining a denuclearization agreement elsewhere in the world, that may well have a knock-on effect for the way in which the Koreans will approach the Americans under these circumstances. And let's remember, the meeting in Korea, I think, is slated for May, which is also the month when the president says he won't recertify the Iranian agreement, the JCPOA.
Okay, I'm afraid we are running out of time quite rapidly here. I do want to spare a thought, though, for the new CIA Director, Gina Haspel. Glenn, what do you think about her?
Well, I spent my career in the agency, and I was intimately involved in the enhanced interrogation program, as some may be aware, and worked in the same outfit as Gina Haspel did. And I have said that she's a talented officer and has been quite successful. I admire many of her. But someone who has been associated at the high level in the design, the implementation, and the management of, quote, the enhanced interrogation program, which is torture, and represents afterwards the United States at a senior level, sends a hideous message, I'm afraid, for Gina's future, that's simply the case. And so to put her in a position as she is now being nominated, I think sends a terrible message.
We've got 30 seconds left. Michael, overall, is this a good shake-up?
Yeah, I'm a little more forgiving of both Gina and Glenn himself than Glenn seems to have been. I think that they were doing what they were asked to do. It was a controversial period in American foreign policy and intelligence. I don't agree with the methods, but I also think they were used on a very small number of people. And it was, more importantly, because of political leadership asking the CIA to do that. I don't think that particular episode sums up Gina's attributes or abilities. So I'm supportive of her candidacy.
It's been fascinating speaking to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us here on Inside Story. Michael O'Hanlon, James Moran and Glenn Carle. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura, Carle, and the whole team here, bye for now.